Hi, everyone. Can you hear me now? Perfect. Welcome, welcome. So sorry. Perfect. Welcome, everyone, to our very first community conversation. We are so excited that you are all here today and that you are joining us. We are streaming also on Facebook, so welcome, welcome. Before we dive in and get started, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. We are going to be utilizing, the only one we have is our chat feature for our Q&A, which will take place at the last 10 minutes of the conversation. So familiarize yourself with the chat. That's the time it will be utilized. That'll be facilitated by myself. I want to welcome you all and thank you all so much for joining. This is the very first of our fall web series, so we are so excited and thankful that Dr. Peterson is here with us to kick this off. Throughout the series, every other week, we're going to be diving into some different topics of conversation that intersect with the movement to end intimate partner violence. So hopefully we all walk away with a little bit more information that will help us in our advocacy and in our work and just further our knowledge and understanding. So I want to appreciate you all for being here. I am going to give an introduction to Dr. Peterson, and then we are going to go ahead and begin. So Dr. CarolAnn Peterson is an extensively experienced anti-domestic violence advocate. She joined the adjunct faculty at USC in 2004. She teaches courses on domestic violence, leadership, and policy advocacy. She was recently appointed to the Los Angeles Mayor's Domestic Violence Steering Committee, which will oversee the research design of a needs assessment with funding provided by the Blue Shield of California Foundation. She authored the book Interpersonal Aggression, Complexities of Domestic and Intimate Partner Abuse, which can also be purchased at her website, which is CarolAnnPeterson.com. So good afternoon, CarolAnn. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. This is exciting. I can't wait to join the other conversations you're going to have.
We can't wait to have you there either. So I'm going to dive right in, and we're going to just start the conversation. We have questions for you, and if there's any other information you'd like to share about yourself and your background, please feel free. We will wrap up our dialogue around 2:50, and that's when we will open it up to Q&A with our attendees. So Dr. Peterson, can you provide an overview of the history of the movement to end domestic violence for us?
Well, technically, until the 1880s, there was no history. Violence was what it was. If it happened, it happened. Men were considered head of the household, and on top of that, you didn't get in trouble if you even went so far as to kill your wife or your children in terms of keeping what they considered family cohesiveness. In the late 1880s, England created a law that basically said you could discipline your wife as long as you did not use anything wider than your thumb or create serious bodily injury, but nobody defined serious bodily injury. And we really stayed that way. North Carolina was one of the first states to actually adopt that law. And it wasn't until literally the early 1980s that we had our first case that really put this on the map in spite of the women's movement. And, you know, and looking also at all the issues, reproductive rights as well as domestic violence. And just a quick aside, for those who aren't paying attention, today happens to be the day the women's right to vote was ratified. It was August 18, 1920. And for those who may not know, the two women who actually got us the vote were Alice Paul and Lucy Burns. Important because without even the right to vote, we might not have domestic violence laws. But in the mid-1980s, a young woman by the name of Tracy Thurman was what I call the perfect victim. She did everything we asked victims to do. She got a restraining order. She actually moved out of the area. And her husband gave up his job in Virginia Beach and followed her to Torrington, Connecticut, and violated this restraining order every time you could think about. And every time she called the police and nothing happened. It wasn't until he actually attempted homicide by stabbing her over 18 times and putting her in the hospital that something happened, because the police department never enforced the restraining order. The police department took over 30 minutes to arrest him, even though they watched him brutally stab her and kick her. And at that point in time, when Torrington, Connecticut Police Department got sued, every law enforcement agency in the country jumped on the bandwagon. I look at it in the sense of, I'm sorry for Tracy's story, but unfortunately, it usually takes a tragedy for us to move something. But it brought law enforcement to the table for the first time. And it gave us a women's movement able to change laws in all of the states. And all states at that time started to change their laws from domestic violence being a misdemeanor to a felony. And once we could make this a felony, it meant it was serious and we could take serious action.
Wow, I mean, thank you so much for providing that overview. I think a lot of that information, some of it I wasn't even aware of. What would you say, in your opinion, has been a pivotal moment in our history that has aided our survivors the most?
Well, Tracy's story, because as I said, it gave us the ability to have states make laws that were felonies as opposed to a misdemeanor. It also provided training for law enforcement. I'm a little prejudiced, but in California, our law enforcement officers get 8 hours of domestic violence training before they're ever allowed to be on the streets. Various law enforcement agencies in California have more than 8 hours for their officers. It depends on the agency. That may not be true in every state. Some states it's only 6 hours, but yet I'm just grateful that they have training. The other, though, happens to be the Violence Against Women Act. That act passed in 1994, and I'm going to be a little bit one-sided here, but that was the Against Women Act, which actually allowed us to provide training for officers, training for district attorneys, to provide victim witness advocates, the ability to have DAs make cases without victims having to be in court and face their abuser. As well as the fact of providing money for shelters so that we can provide more beds, more counseling, more services that we weren't able to provide before.
Awesome, thank you. What would you say, like just looking back and looking at the history of the movement and all the strides that we made and the work that's been done, is there anything that we can take a look at and say, hey, you know what, we learned a lesson and that can help kind of guide us as we move forward, either, you know, pitfalls or mistakes that were made or some things we did that were absolutely great, but I would, you know, just love some time to kind of chit chat about, you know, what worked and what didn't work and what can help us moving forward.
One of the things that's really helped is we've continued to expand the Violence Against Women Act. It is renewed every 5-6 years, and we've been able to add to that. In the first round, you had to be married. When we reauthorized in 2000, then we were able to provide for battered immigrant victims who might be married to a legal permanent resident or a U.S. citizen, or we were able to utilize the U visa, which is for any victim of a crime. It doesn't have to be just domestic violence, but it was included, so that if they're undocumented, we have the ability to get them to be able to stay here and have safety. The U visa, however, does have a caveat, which I understand I'm not always happy about. They must be cooperative with law enforcement and the DA's office in the case. That can be really hard for victims who are U.S. citizens, let alone if you're someone who's undocumented. The other is the fact that in 2013, we added Native Americans being able to have jurisdiction over non-Native Americans who create domestic violence on tribal lands. What happened before is they got away free. Nobody had jurisdiction over them, and so they weren't able to be arrested and held accountable. And also in 2013, we actually included the LGBT community to provide money for services and training. All of those mean that we know we have work to do and we keep expanding. One of our pitfalls, and we have not been really good about this, we have not provided the services we should for men. We sometimes forget that men are also victims. And we need to make sure that anybody who is being abused in their home has the right to safety. Most of our shelters across the country don't take men, and it's not because we don't want to, as you know, and hopefully most of our audience knows, and that's because most of the shelters are converted homes. It's communal living, so you've got issues of modesty, and some shelters also don't take teenage boys, partly because they're exhibiting the behavior of the abuser. And also, if you're in a communal living situation, can't put a 16-year-old boy in a room with a 13-year-old girl. Doesn't work real well. Not something we'd want to condone. So we have to find better ways of assisting men, LGBT, and those who are teenagers. Because we also don't have safe spaces for teenagers who are in dating violent relationships. And I know it's an issue of liability for a shelter because you then become the legal guardian, but we need to find ways of providing safety for teens. We also don't do a very good job of assisting those who are disabled. We need to find better ways of providing safety for those who are in wheelchairs, those who might be elderly with walkers and on medication. So we still have a lot of work to do, but as I remind my students, we only had the movement basically 50 years, so we don't need to be forgiven, but we need to be understood that we still have a lot of work to do, and we're working on it. We're still making progress.
Awesome, thank you. I agree. I feel like there's a lot of ways that I've seen we've made so much progress, and then there's some, intersectional points of the movement where it's like, wow, we were there with this certain aspect maybe 20 years ago, and so now it helps us catch up. I love that you brought up, men and being able to provide services and even domestic violence prevention for our men. What would you say are some recommendations that you have and how we can actually include men in our work and in our advocacy?
Well, I think a couple of ways. One, men who are supportive of us in the movement, of being there, of remembering that there are allies and including them. Changing our terminology. We've called this a women's issue when it's a community issue. It not only affects our families, it affects our friends, it affects our neighbors, it affects the workplace. So we need to remember that this is an inclusive issue. One of the things I love in the video called Broken Vows is one of the reverends says, if you want to stop violence in the street, you got to stop it in the home. And we need to look at being more inclusive. And so calling this as a community issue lets everybody know it is also their responsibility, that they can help, that there are ways of doing this. We also need to look at finding places for men, the ability to give them some safe space. I know many of our shelters across the country will provide a hotel voucher, but we still need to find them a safe sanctuary, someplace where they actually can have the counseling and the services that we provide our female victims. Some shelters around the country still don't have the ability to serve children for children so that they understand what they went through was not their fault. That what they experienced is something a lot of children experience who go through trauma. More services for the courts. As much as I think we have some really wonderful judges out there, I don't think we provide enough training for them to understand what this really means in terms of their role. We also need to provide better services in the courts for our victims. If somebody has to drag their kids to court to file for a restraining order, that is huge. Some courts do have a daycare where you can check your kids in. Some don't, and we need to provide better resources for the courts to also have victims have a safe space for their kids so the kids don't have to be in the courtroom listening to this. I also look at the fact that we don't provide enough services for the LGBT community. When I look around the country and realize that for a lot of rural areas, services are few and far between or not at all, that's really difficult, really hard. And the same is true for female victims. If they live in rural areas, finding services may be difficult. One of my favorite articles is called "Where Do You Go When It's 40 Below?" And it really talks about how to provide services to Alaskan Native women. If you're in a village and you're 400 miles from the nearest service center, how do I make sure you're safe? So we have a lot of areas where you could expand the violence against women. We overlook the Asian community. There's always that misperception of, oh, it doesn't happen in the Asian community. It happens everywhere. And we don't provide enough services and services in their languages to be able to provide them safety and somewhere to go. Like a lot of cultures, the Asian community, if you seek services outside your community, you may be ostracized. We have to find ways around making victims of different cultures feel safe, that if they're going to be ostracized by their community, it's okay. But we always have to remember to be 2 steps ahead of an abuser. A story that I use for my students is a friend was working at Legal Aid, and she was talking to her client and said, oh, we can offer all kinds of services, including shelter. Her client literally ran for the front door. When she caught up with her, she asked her what happened. The abuser had programmed her so much that if somebody offered her services or shelter, she needed to run because it was a code word for underground prostitution. So we have to remember that abusers are going to be out there countering everything we do. So more training in terms of even culture and diversity.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love that you lifted up that sometimes we do have populations that are either marginalized, or sometimes we forget or we just assume that maybe this isn't happening because, you know, there's a lot of stigma around disclosing what's happening behind closed doors. And I think historically, you know, in my work in prevention.
Sorry, that was a little garbled.
Oh, can you hear me? But it's been nice to see a lot of these things come to the forefront and for us to be able to have these conversations.
Garbled, little static.
Oh, it's a little static. Can you hear me now, CarolAnn?
Yes.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Awesome.
Okay.
But I was just saying that, you know, it's amazing to see these things come to the forefront, and a lot of these conversations that we couldn't have, you know, as I always say, like 20 years ago, nobody talked about domestic violence. Like that was something that happened and stayed behind closed doors. And same goes for teen dating violence. You know, 10 to 15 years ago, that was not a conversation we were having. When I was in high school, I didn't have anyone there to tell me what a red flag was. So seeing the advances, and that helps, you know, identifying maybe some other places where we need to have these conversations. You know, a lot of policies and laws are changing to add protections for survivors. What are some protections that maybe we're currently trying to add? Or are there anything that, you know, policy-wise that we should be aware of?
Yeah, here in California, and I think New York is attempting this, we're following an example from England. We're starting to add coercive control into our language and having it be enforced. Not sure how we're going to work out the details of law enforcement to enforce it, but to include it in restraining orders and to include it realizing it's a tactic used by abusers. You know, we overlook verbal abuse, we overlook the emotional abuse that occurs, but that's all part of the coercive control. So I haven't checked in about a month on the law here in California where it stands. England started this. They actually did it. Ireland followed suit, I believe, after them. Scotland and Wales did it. And I sat here, you know, in the U.S. going, wait, how did you guys get there before we did? We're supposed to set the example. I get a little jealous. But I was so glad to see somebody was able to do it, and then we could follow in those footsteps. But it's also overlooked even by judges and law enforcement of coercive control. Oh, well, if you get called a bad name, so what? But it's a pattern, and we need to remember it's part of the pattern of abuse. We've also been looking at laws in other states where strangulation is not included. It's one of those that we've been looking at over the past 10 years. I'm very proud to say that I'm a certified expert witness on strangulation, having taken the 4.5-day training from the National Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention. the most intense course ever, but I am so pleased to have taken it because I learned so much. California has made that it's actually an attempted homicide if you're not murdered, and a homicide if you are, but other states haven't quite rose to that level. So it's important for us to realize we still have states that need to come along and include that in their policies. 37 states have included animals now to be in the restraining orders. As we all know, many times victims are not going to leave if the pet's in danger. And so to see at least 37 states have put that as part of, but it's not just pets. We have to remember livestock. For those who live in rural areas, livestock is the income. It is how they survive. And if we don't have that covered, then abusers could really severely devastate the income of a victim. So we're making progress. We still haven't quite bridged our gap and looking as intently as we should at traumatic brain injury. It's not quite been included in policy laws for domestic violence, but I think we need to start looking down that road, not only from strangulation, but from the repeated blows to the head, the repeated, head banged against the wall. All of those come into play, and we need to really look at that. I think it's somewhat of a sad commentary on our society when we looked at traumatic brain injury for sports figures before we looked at domestic violence.
That's a very good point. I didn't even think about that, and looking at like maybe trauma that's caused by injury and how sometimes, and I wonder if there's like some stigma that's tied to that, but if I'm injured by my intimate partner or maybe not fully disclosing the nature of the injury. That's interesting. As you were speaking, I kept thinking about, going back a little bit to this being a woman's issue, or tied really closely sometimes historically to like women's liberation. And I love that you brought up that it's really not, it's a community issue, and something I love that, Jackson Katz shares in his TED Talk is that this is, it's about leadership, and this is not just strictly a women's issue, it's a men's issue, it's an everyone issue. How do we, the shift I know from domestic violence to using, I prefer, of course, IPV or intimate partner violence, since that's that umbrella term to include men and the LGBTQ plus community. What are some ways that we as a community can kind of shift that perspective from, a women's issue and women's liberation to more of like this communal focus when it comes to, stopping intimate partner violence or domestic violence?
Well, and I'm actually changing my terminology from violence to abuse, because violence indicates something physical, and we know that there's so many details that happen that are not physical abuse. So I've shifted to say domestic abuse, intimate partner abuse. But we have a tendency that we don't say something when we overhear conversations. Even simple things. I live in a very small town, about 3 hours sort of northeast of Los Angeles. And every once in a while I hear in my community, we used to have a young woman who was the manager of our hardware store, and Michelle is gay. And every once in a while somebody would say, "Oh, do you know the he, she at the hardware store?" And I am apt to turn around and go, "Excuse me, could you not use that terminology? She is a human being and her name is Michelle." "Well, she's lesbian." And I go, "And the issue is?" All of my neighbors know that if you're going to speak out of line, I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to let it be known that this is unacceptable. The same thing for domestic abuse, when people have said, "Oh, I don't want to get involved. Not my problem." It is your problem, because this is somebody who could be homeless. This is somebody whose kids are not going to school because they're afraid if they left, they'd come home to a parent who was dead. So it is their issue. We just need to educate the public why it's their issue. Why is this important to them? We still get resistance from businesses about, "Oh no, domestic violence doesn't happen in my workplace. I don't have." If your workforce has women, and even men, LGBTQ, somebody's a victim. It is your issue. And it's sad that I think the last survey I saw was 2007 by what then was the Corporate Alliance in Partner Violence with Liz Claiborne. 63% of CEOs acknowledged the issue, but only 12% said it was really a concern that they had to have. So we also need to get businesses to understand that in your workforce, somebody is probably a victim or has been a victim. We need to do better training of medical personnel. I hear so often from residents saying, if I got 2 hours, I got a lot. Well, you're going to be a medical doctor and I haven't given you the training that you need to identify this person or this child as a victim and supply you with the resources. The other thing I hear from medical personnel is, I don't ask the question because I don't know the resources. I'm afraid if I get a yes, I don't know where to send them. So we have to do training of everybody. We also need to do better training of cross-training. I still am trying to learn more about HIV/AIDS for our populations. We need to know more about substance abuse with our clients. Substance abuse providers need to know more about domestic violence. So we also need to do all of that cross-training. So it becomes this huge community issue and we're not all sitting in our own separate little lanes.
Oh, I love that you shared that, Dr. Peterson, because it's true. We see a lot of us who are working either in this field or in different fields, we tend to be very siloed and we're just, you know, super focused on what we're doing, and which makes sense. I mean, we have a job to do and we have services that we need to provide, but that cross-training, you know, a few years back, we did participate in a cross-disciplinary training, which was also funded by Blue Shield, where we did train you know, medical residents, and we went in and trained OBGYNs and helped them identify. And, you know, we tried through that training, we let them know, you know, the person sitting in front of you, whether male or female, there's no way to identify a perfect victim. It can honestly be anyone in this room, and they may look like you or I or anyone else. So I love that you shared that. That cross training is so important and so crucial. I wanted to ask, you know, we've been seeing, I always say preventionist at heart. My background is in public health, and way back in the day, I was advocating for prevention, using those prevention strategies when it did come to intimate partner violence and sexual violence. And at the time, it wasn't very understood, and these weren't conversations that we were having very regularly. In your opinion, why do you feel that there has been the addition of prevention in this field, in this work, when it comes to domestic violence? And this field typically, oftentimes, you know, historically has really focused on intervention, as you mentioned, such as a restraining order or therapeutic services. So where do you think this shift has come from to help us, you know, contribute our work in this way?
Well, partly because you can't stop something if all you're going to do is intervene. Because that means it's already there, it's already happening. So prevention means we need to look early about how we teach our kids of being in relationships, of how we teach our kids to treat one another. I always ask in a training, so remember what it was like when you were 5 years old? What happened when a little boy or little girl liked you? Well, usually they kind of shoved you, or they pulled your hair, or pulled on your clothes, and we thought that was cute. We thought it was funny. We can't do that anymore. We have to realize that that is how you view treating somebody, and age appropriately means we need to say, you know, that's not a nice way to treat somebody. Would you like them to treat you that way? And we need to be really nicer and kinder, and really get them to understand that this is unacceptable behavior without making them feel like they're scolded and making them feel like they should feel guilty. We want them to know it's just inappropriate, because when they do it at 16, they're going to look at us and say, well, I did it when I was 5, what's the problem? So we need to really start that prevention very early. Programs that go into middle school and high school and are 8 or 16 weeks about what are relationships, what does that look like, and then do follow-up to see if there's a difference, really has shown that most of those programs work, that it reduces teen dating violence. And if I can reduce it when they're teens, when they're 5 years old, then these are people when they get to be adults who probably are not going to do this behavior. And that's what you want. You want it to not happen when they get to be adults or when they're even 16. But we get reluctance from education boards of, well, you know, who's going to do this? Is it teachers? No, you can bring in outside speakers. They have a tendency of feeling overworked, and they are, and don't get me wrong. In these days of a pandemic, teachers, but we're not demonstrating it. If we're not looking at their own behavior, then we're not doing prevention. We're going to be doing intervention. And I think one of the things is we came to the table late with the term prevention. If you look at almost any other issue, they try and do prevention early, and we were so busy intervening. Prevention kind of came to us down the road. It was like, oh my gosh, if we're going to stop this, we have to do prevention, and we have to do it when they're little. I'm going to sort of let your audience know a little piece. When we talk about gang violence, 82% of gang members came from violent homes. So they didn't just walk out and join the wrong crowd. They were already violent when they left their home. But people think that gangs recruit their members when they are 8, 9, 10 years old. They start recruiting at 5, because at 5 you're impressionable. At 5 I can impress you with money. I can impress you with cars. And I always said if corporate America wanted to know how to structure, look at a gang. They are so highly structured. Everybody has a role. Everybody knows their role. It's also why we need to look at doing our best for low-income communities of better education in general, not just on violence, but in general, and providing better ways. And also, we don't do a good job of providing welfare for those who are low income and how it's handled and structured.
Thank you for that, CarolAnn. I would like to ask also, so how do we, if we're sitting here and listening to this information, and maybe some of it's new and maybe some of it's not, some of these conversations can be very intimidating. I mean, even for myself. And I will say, us as an agency, Laura's House, we do accept men into our shelter, which is absolutely amazing. And we are able to bring in also children up to age 18, male or female, and, you know, transgender individuals. And I can remember when that wasn't the case, you know, over the course of my career here, and seeing these changes, which have been absolutely amazing. Same goes for our work and training, you know, law enforcement or training. I mean, I've gone into the district attorney's office and provided training there. How would you encourage, you know, the audience or our public just to, what are the conversation starters? How do I initiate that conversation, whether it's with a law enforcement agency or maybe it's the judicial system or maybe an entity that seems like a little bit intimidating or scary? How do I, you know, make myself known in that space, and how do I start that conversation?
My recommendation is always start with all of you in a shelter. Sit down and talk with your local shelter staff about what they do, how they do it. Ask for information that they can disseminate. If they're at a city council meeting even, what is the policy in the city council in that town? Do they keep records at law enforcement agencies of their domestic violence calls? They should. Most states pretty well demand it, but you may not know it if you don't ask for it. Law enforcement may get a little touchy when you ask. Tell them you're a concerned citizen. This is an area of interest. Find out how the laws work in your state, in your city. I've always loved, and people from Beverly Hills are not going to be happy with me, but I've always heard from law enforcement in Beverly Hills, we have no domestic violence. And I thought, really? That's really interesting. Not sure how they've managed it, but according to them, they have none. You want to know, is there a mandatory arrest policy in your city? It should be. California state law says arrest should be mandatory. but it kind of gets glossed over and misinterpreted of, well, it says I should, but I don't have to. So some agencies don't make mandatory arrest. Ask your city if they have a mandatory arrest policy. And it is intimidating to talk to law enforcement. But if you have the ability, they may not do it under COVID, so you might have to wait. Ask for a ride-along. People always think I'm crazy when I say that. I have always loved my ride-alongs because one of the things that you get, officers let down their guard in their squad cars. They're very open about who they are, how they do their job. They're very open about asking questions. And so I've always learned a lot about how the officers operate on the street when I do a ride-along. So it's asking questions of the agencies, asking politely, not demanding, not being pushy, and just being honest. This is an area I'm passionate about. What can you tell me happens here?
Awesome. What would you say as we have about, so if anyone has any questions, please start to think about those things. Pretty soon, in about 13-ish minutes, we're going to open it up for a Q&A. But, what would you say, just looking back, and I know you've already highlighted some of these things, but what would you say is either the biggest lesson or the biggest lesson that we can look back to, and how does this influence change moving forward, and that, and us being change makers in the work?
Don't be afraid to change policy, whether it's at your agency, whether it's at the state or federal level. When I was a registered lobbyist in Sacramento for about 10 years, people would always say, but I can't change policy. Yeah, policy gets changed. It's done by citizens. Talk to your state legislator. Go sign up on their mailing list. Whether you like them or not, whether they're of your party or not, sign up on their mailing list. You want to know how they vote. You want to know what issues are important to them. I have one of the most ultra-conservative Congress people ever. He's the minority leader in the House, Kevin McCarthy. I'm on the mailing list. I get notifications. It is not uncommon for me to send an email saying, by the way, I think the vote that you did was not right. I will give him credit. 2013, with the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, including LGBT, including Native amendments, and I said, by the way, if you vote in whole, I promise you 5 votes when you're for re-election. And I held out. I did that. I gave him the 5 votes because he voted the way I asked him to. With this reauthorization, he's pushing for taking those out. And so I wrote a letter and I said, I have no problem in telling those 5 people that I gave you last time to take their vote back. Put them on notice. Let them know. Because believe it or not, your email counts. Make it personal. If it looks like a form letter, they don't take it as seriously, but if you can put some sort of personal note in there, they do take it seriously. Staff does read the emails. Same thing for your city council. Find out how your city council handles a lot of issues within the community, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's domestic abuse, whether it's child abuse. What's the policy and procedures? And hold your federal legislators accountable. We're fortunate in California, we have 2 women senators who are truly amazing. However, if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are in the White House, we lose a senator. But I'm on their mailing list. I want to know how they vote and why they vote the way they do. And sometimes they're going to surprise you. Sometimes somebody you don't think will give you a yes vote does, and sometimes somebody you think will give you a yes vote does not. And you also want to ask them, why did you vote the way you did? So change policy. As I tell my students, rock the boat. Don't tip it over though, however. Don't fall in the water. Rock the boat. None of us like change, but things don't happen unless we push for it. So we really have to go out of our way to see that change happens. Don't feel intimidated and take baby steps. You don't have to start with your congressperson. You can start with your city council, and just kind of take those baby steps. And if they're unsure about what to do, I'm sure they can contact you. They can send me an email, and we'll walk them through it.
Awesome. I love that. Being able to, policy is obviously very important. I think for a lot of us, sometimes that can also be something that's intimidating, just like starting conversations. Looking back at our history, what would you say in your perspective were either the conversation starters, or maybe during that time, we know the first DV shelter didn't exist until the 1970s. What were the shifts during that time period, or what was happening during that time period that kind of led us to the changes that have allowed us to work in the field of domestic violence prevention and understand what battered women is and how those things came to light during that time period?
I think a lot of it is we found our voice. When you're starting, you have a tendency of being very strident and very, very pushy, and people kind of go, whoa. Then you kind of dial it back, go, okay, maybe I'm being too forceful. Then we take a step way too back. Somewhere in the middle, you begin to find your voice, the true voice that you need to use. And so in that, we kind of found our voices and found that we could be forceful, we could be somewhat intimidating, we could advocate for what we wanted without alienating people, without having people go, oh, no, I don't want to talk about that. It used to be that if I would tell people what I did, they would kind of go, oh, change the conversation. Now I almost don't want to tell them what I do if I'm on a plane or on the train or somewhere else, because they go, oh, my cousin went through this and this is what happens. And so it's like I wind up working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Yeah. But it's because we've made it comfortable for them to now talk about it, to ask about it. And so when they find somebody who understands, they're willing to tell the story.
Awesome. What would you say are the biggest positives that came out of this movement, looking at our history? Like, what were the biggest changes and the biggest positives, and maybe what do we have to look forward to?
Well, first of all, we created shelters so victims weren't sleeping on our floors, which is what we did. Any of us in part of the movement was, put victims and children on our floor and probably breaking multiple fire codes. But also there's been a turn with the shelters. You're all doing now client-centered services as opposed to one size fits all. And also family justice centers, the ability to do a one-stop where I don't have to run all over huge counties like Orange County, Los Angeles, or even Chicago to get services. I can go to one location and get what I need. The fact that they know now, most victims do, when they seek services, that we're not going to be judgmental, that we're not going to say, I told you so, which is where family and friends many times do. I told you not to be in that relationship. I told you not to come here anymore. I've taken you in 7 times. I'm not doing it anymore. It's also what I tell my students: if you're specifically going to work in the field of domestic abuse, you have to be in it for the long haul. We may be the last person that they turn to, and because everybody else has abandoned them. But we've also had the ability to look at ourselves, to know that we're not serving men, to know that we're not doing our best for the LGBT community, and putting our best foot forward to see what we can do to make those happen. And how we function sometimes, changing our terminology, wanting to be more inclusive and looking at it as a community issue. So I think a lot of where we've made real progress, real strides, is looking at ourselves and challenging ourselves and admitting where we've had some downfalls, where we haven't been as good as we should have been. The shelters that still will turn you away if you're LGBT. Not because they can't provide, it's because they don't want to. I often hear from lesbians in particular, I was turned away because I was lesbian, because I was going to make staff and clients feel uncomfortable. And my bottom line is train your staff, train your clients. because they have the right to be safe like any of the rest of us. So looking at those and accepting that we've had that, pitfalls ourselves.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you shared, CarolAnn, that we, we've had the opportunity to look at ourselves. And I think sometimes, as a movement or in this work, that's not easy to do, but I think that's kind of helped us move into that. What you mentioned earlier is being victim-centered and client-centered and more trauma-informed. And I love that. I love that you're bringing that up. And I hope that as we move forward in our work that we can center ourselves on that. We have about 4-ish minutes left before we jump into our Q&A with those who are in attendance with us. So what would you like to share with everyone, Dr. Peterson, other either tidbits, information, takeaways, something that you want to leave with us this afternoon?
Well, I'm going to challenge them that in spite of COVID, we still have not passed the Violence Against Women Act that should have been reauthorized in 2018. We need to put Congress on notice that there are other things that they need to be doing and working on. I'm hearing from some agencies that some of that funding is starting to look less and less because it's not been reauthorized. So we need to let Congress know we understand COVID is huge and it's put all of us in a real dilemma, but there's other work they still need to be doing. Right now they're on recess, although I understand Nancy Pelosi is calling them back in for a vote on funding the Postal Service, which is a whole other issue. Even for our clients, because some of our clients may depend on mail service for a lot of their needs. But we also have to challenge ourselves under COVID. How are we providing services? I was on a nationwide call about 2 months ago, and I was really excited when I heard some of the outside the box thinking. They're showing up and helping food banks and having information available at the food bank. Whether it's a pamphlet or whatever, and the fact that victims were willing, because they didn't have their partner there, to say, kind of go to the side and say, can I talk to you? Following up with their victims on the pretense of, are you okay with diapers? Is there anything from WIC that you need, so that the victim can actually tell them yes, no, and let them understand. Some victims have also got creative. They've been texting to agencies when they're needing help and assistance, and then immediately understanding how to erase it. So we need to get as creative and think outside the box. Sometimes that's hard. We get comfortable in what we do and how we do it because it functions, but a pandemic like this tells us that there are times we have to be creative, think outside the box, and how do we better help our clients under these conditions? Because I know that the last report I saw also about 2 months ago from Denver is they had an increase of 300 new calls a day of domestic violence. That tells you how absolutely devastating this pandemic is for our victims stuck at home with an abuser. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. Peterson. I love that you said that, because I feel like even looking at our history, that took a lot of outside of the box thinking for the time period. And of course, COVID, I feel like that's nonstop outside the box is what we've been doing. But, lifting up the fact that that need is still there. And I love that you shared partnering with, food banks and where people still are, so we can make sure they have the resources. As you mentioned, medical providers. I love that being able to train them, we're able to equip them with those resources. So I love that. I think that's huge. Thank you so much. I want to thank you for having this conversation with me, and I want to open it up to Q&A from those who are attendees. So we have our chat box available for those of you who are joining us via webinar. We are going to turn it over to you to hold a Q&A session here with Dr. Peterson if anyone has any questions. So our first question, we have someone who says, I live in Petaluma and there are no services or anything available for DVR abuse. Where do I begin?
I would look at a neighboring city or county that has services, ask them what they do, how they do it, and then talk to your city council. If there is a city council, I know some cities are unincorporated and don't have that, what could make it happen? It will be a long road to do it. But, you know, everything comes with baby steps. A lot of it is finding somebody who's trained to do it, somebody who's got the facility, the funding, but I would check outside. Now, I know Northern California, Butte County has no services. What they do is they contract, I believe it's with Lake County. So they transfer some of their welfare money over to Lake to take their victims. So you might see if there's an agency in a neighboring city or county that would be willing to do that. Santa Rosa, okay.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Okay. Well, she says Santa Rosa, they don't offer much and they are very big. Try somebody bordering on the other side. So you might have to do some research and see what's going on and talk to staff. But, and unfortunately we have that. We have many cities and counties, at least 5 counties in California that have no services simply for the fact that they don't really have the ability to do it or sometimes funding. YWCA, okay, of Santa Rosa. Yeah, YWCAs are good places to start. We have a couple of YWCAs here in Los Angeles County that provide, that have run shelters and provide services. So, other questions? Well, you have me.
In case anyone's taking a second to chat, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I was also going to mention that a great resource in case you're located somewhere where there is not, and maybe you want to find out where the closest DV program or shelter is, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is an excellent resource to be able to call and just say, hey, this is where I'm located. Who's closest to me in case, you know, Google or your search engine isn't giving you the information that you're looking for.
And Jennifer, though, while you were saying that, what occurred to me is also check with the welfare office. Where do they refer victims? Because if victims declare at a welfare office, they have the ability to stop their clock. But where would they refer them? So that's another resource to check out.
That's a good point. As you're saying that, Dr. Peterson, I was thinking, say, for instance, you are in more of a rural area, and so you are doing like a ride along with law enforcement. Would that be a good resource to maybe chit chat with them and see where they refer if someone is needing services?
Sure. Or even depending, some law enforcement don't have their lobbies open, but if you can just go into the lobby and say, you know, if I know somebody who's a victim, where would you refer them?
That's a good strategy.
Use all of our resources.
So we have a question here from Matthew. How are we serving or not serving military and veteran members and our spouses who may not be comfortable or able to access on base or VA services?
It's a hit and miss. Some areas, and I'm going to brag about San Diego. San Diego has a memorandum of understanding between their Family Justice Center and every branch of the military. You know, they have all 5 branches in San Diego. And so when they started the Family Justice Center, they brought all 5 branches of the military in. And so they did a memorandum of understanding. The military bases down there will honor civilian restraining orders, and the civilian law enforcement down there honors the military restraining orders. But that's not true for every military base. I have a former student who literally works in the family advocacy program, and she is very upset when victims don't get the services that they should get, because almost everybody will override a victim's restricted reporting, not wanting it to go to the base commander, will override their wishes and tell the commanding officer anyway, which in my estimation puts a spouse more in danger. But we also have not been good at telling spouses their rights, because they do have the ability to have that person put into barracks quarters out of the house. They do have the ability to provide some services, including some moving services for victims who would like to get out and leave. So we need to make it where it's more confidential, easier, and more encompassing.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Peterson. We have about 5 minutes left, and we have a question here that is asking, What do services look like for those who cause harm, and how have they changed over time? Are they effective? And I will ask you, Dr. Peterson, to please put your email address in the chat for any questions that we do not get to. Dr. Peterson is open to having you email her. So we are going to have her put her email there for you in the chat so that you can send her any questions that we don't get to.
And the chat box keeps wanting to elude me. I click on it and it moves. And it's not letting me in.
I'll go ahead and add that. But if you want to answer that question in our final few minutes, and I will put I believe I have your other email address here.
Yeah,
in the chat.
Services for those who cause harm. You know, predominantly we have veterans intervention programs, and I'm okay with them to a degree. I think they're effective if somebody wants to work a program where we don't take the extra step, and I've really been working with judges in California to change this, which is they should have individual counseling. If you're not going to deal with their childhood trauma, since most of them learned this as children, I'm only going to partially heal them, and you want to heal the whole person. So we really need to get them into individual counseling. The reason I use abuse versus violence, because it's more than just violence in the relationship. It's not always physical. And I said 82% of gang members, yes, came from a violent home. Somebody's got about traumatic brain injury. You know, there's some really interesting and good articles out there. And it does have life-altering ramifications if we're not paying attention. So it's also on us as advocates to ask the questions. And sometimes we're not asking the questions about head injury or even strangulation. So it becomes really important for us to ask those questions.
It's good that you brought up strangulation, Dr. Peterson. I think I went to a training a few years back at the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and strangulation is actually huge because even though someone may have experienced it, the chances for still like mortality or death is in like a 2-week span. Is it not? I could be off on that, but it was like, it wasn't immediately, even though the injury had happened, and it puts them at great risk. And a lot of us, you know, aren't aware of that or the need to assess for the need for medical treatment. It can be
within a 2-week span, but also what we've learned is one attempted non-fatal strangulation increases the likelihood of a homicide by 750%. This makes it a very lethal household. So we need to be more forthcoming in asking the questions.
Yeah, that was something they had lifted up too. Thank you all so much. And I want to thank you, Dr. CarolAnn Peterson, for joining us for our very first conversation.
This was exciting.
Yeah, and the information is so useful. I did put Dr. Peterson's email there in the chat box for everyone. Please take note of it, and she would love your questions. I hope that you will all continue to join us. These conversations are going to happen bi-weekly. Next week, we are going to discuss human trafficking and how that intersects with domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So please join us, and we're going to be covering a variety of topics. And I want to thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Peterson.
My pleasure. And thank the audience for attending.
Thank you all so much. We hope you all have a great afternoon.
Everybody be safe.
Bye.